Unfortunately today, Larry Schaff has been taken unwell, so hasn't been able to attend the talk. We're delighted to welcome Kelly Wilder, who has stepped in at the last minute and has been brilliant. So we are glad to have her here. Kelly is the Director of Photographic History Research Centre at De Montfort University, Leicester. From 2000 to 2003, she was Assistant Editor on the correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot, and she serves on the advisory board of the Talbot Catalogue Raisonné project at the Bodleian Library. She is the author of numerous books and articles on photography, archives and science, most recently with Greg Mittman, Documenting the World, Film Photography and the Scientific Record. Current projects include the meaning of photographic materials and science in a photographic age. We also have Hans Kraus Jr., who established a dealership in New York has been an established dealer in New York since 1984, and he deals mainly in 19th and early 20th century prints, specialising in the paper negative era, which flourished before 1860. Prior to that, he worked at Christie's in London and New York. The gallery publishes monographs on early photographs and catalogues under the series title of Some Pictures. Artists include William Henry Fox Talbot, Anna Atkins, Gustave Le Gray, Roger Fenton, J.B. Green, Helen Ann Adamson, Julia Margaret Cameron, and many others, as well as work from the photo succession. Recently, the gallery began collaborating with contemporary artists who were influenced by the work and techniques of the earliest photographers. The current exhibition at Outfighter London includes photographs by Fox Talbot, along with works by 7 contemporary artists who have recognised his influence. I do hope you all will get a chance to pop down there. Hans is also in the space some of the time, as well as his colleagues, so he'll be able to answer some extra questions then, I'm sure. Richard Ovenden was educated at Durham University and University College London, and has worked as a professional librarian since 1985. He has served on the staff of Durham University Library, the House of Lords Library, the National Library of Scotland, as Deputy Head of the Rare Books Section, the University of Edinburgh as Director of Collections, and since 2003 at the Bodleian Libraries. He is, the guy to talk about too, about the Catalogue Raisonné at the Bodleian, so we're delighted to have you all here today. I'll let them speak. Some of the speakers may be coming up to the lectern, so I will move it over slightly, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to start off this triumvirate on Talbot, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the acquisition of the personal archive of William Henry Fox Talbot that the Bodleian made in 2014, and the stimulus that that has made to our engagement both with contemporary photography and with scholarship around Fox Talbot. And that's going to be a theme picked up in more detail by Kelly, as is the theme of the collaboration, the inspiration that Talbot gives to contemporary photography, which Hans is going to talk about in more detail. But I thought I would set the scene with a little bit of background about our own activity at the Bodleian in Oxford with Talbot. And these are just a few kind of placeholders. I thought this slide might be a good place to start off, as it was taken just down the river or up the river. Very close to this spot by Talbot. And his archive remained essentially intact at Laycock Abbey until the early 20th century. And at that point, it began to be dispersed. A great group of very important materials, cameras, prints, correspondence and notebooks was given to the Science Museum. And later in the 20th century, other groups of material left the confines of Laycock Abbey and the family ownership. And you can't have a talk on Talbot without this image, but why not have it in negative rather than positive? And the British Library acquired a major portion of material, actually, technically, I think, in the early years of this century. So a single photographer's archive, his life, as expressed in an archival form, was dispersed over probably a century. And the last portion of that material to be dispersed was not actually primarily photographic material, but documented the broader life of the individual that we know as the great pioneer of photography. But for us as a library, this was extremely interesting and important material. So it included his passport. It included a whole series of drawing albums from not only by Talbot himself, but by members of his family, by his wife, and other members of the household, really. And some of these albums included early photographic images, and there are dozens of them which have barely been studied and will bear lots of future research. And there were fantastic documentary material. Here's a very early, very, very charming letter from this precocious young individual writing a note to his mama.
I think he was 6 years old.
He was 6 years old,
yeah.
Absolutely. But then there are other slightly more unusual materials in the archive, not things that typically, or to the kind of public imagination perhaps, typically acquired by research libraries. But actually, if you look into most great libraries around the world, you will find things which do not fit the bound volume sheet of paper model that one expects. Lots of libraries have always acquired strange things. A previous library I worked in had Samuel Johnson's teapot. And they helped to provide a picture of a life in the round. And of course, Talbot, in his time, did not think of himself as a photographer. He was many things simultaneously. He was a member of Parliament. He was a father. He was a husband. He was a landowner. He was an employer. He was a scientist. He was a member of various learned bodies here in this city. And he also did experiments in photography. And the archive that we acquired helps to demonstrate the full breadth of his life and to place photography in that context. But along with the archive came some objects which have extraordinary resonance for his own photographic life because of his photography of them. One of those was his library, so a large portion of his surviving private library of printed books, many of them presented to him, was part of the library. And of course, it was a subject of one of the early images to be published by Talbot in The Pencil of Nature. But it included the glassware that you see here. Beautiful objects of 19th century glass, but of great power for the history of photography, because of course they feature as subjects in one of the plates in this seminal publication. You can see why as a librarian I get excited about anything to do with The Pencil of Nature, and to have objects that were subjects in that book, that seminal publication, one of the landmarks in the history of the book, is of great importance and interest. So I'll just pause here to say that the process of acquiring the archive was not a trivial task. It was a purchase from members of the family, and it required grant proposals, it required a public campaign to gather support for the acquisition of the archive, and it was of a scale that was beyond our normal acquisitions budget for rare materials, which is, even though we're in a great prestigious institution, actually pretty tiny. So we were resolved to acquire the archive and to preserve it for scholarship and for the public good here in the United Kingdom, and we put all of our efforts behind that campaign. And we had strong support for it. And part of that strong support was reaching out to the contemporary photographic community And this was one aspect of the acquisition of an archive, a photographic archive, which helped for our institution to provide a catalyst for engagement of various kinds, not only with scholarship, but also with contemporary photography. So we had an arrangement with Sotheby's to have an auction of donated prints by contemporary photographers as part of the fundraising campaign. And lots of contemporary photographers rallied to the cause, and I've just got a few images of some of the objects that were donated. Here is Martin Parr in Laycock Abbey in 1989, photographing the to-do that happened there in that year. Here is Susan Durges, and here is Nadav Kanda. And so it was a really wonderful experience for us to be able to make these connections and to have the prints donated, which were then sold by Sotheby's, which provided some of the funds for the acquisition of the archive. So I was a little sorry, actually, that we weren't able to keep the prints for our collection. There was a kind of, I had a bit of a split personality at one point, thinking, actually, I'd really like to have these for the collection. But it was a wonderful engagement point for us to have. But one of the other things that happened in the process of acquiring the collection was actually through Hans's good offices, a connection with Hiroshi Sugimoto. And Sugimoto asked to borrow part of the archive to help him make new photographic images as part of his series of engagements and interest with Talbot, which I'll leave Hans to talk about in greater skill. But I thought I'd share some of the images that I took as when I worked with the Sugimoto studio in New York, and you can see some of the sequence of images that were made through the loan of an extremely interesting object, which I will leave Hans to talk about in a little while. But part of the deal that we made with Sugimoto was that in return for lending part of the archive, he would give us some prints for our collection. And what you're seeing here, and here's one of them that we put on show when our refurbished building, the Western Library in Oxford, reopened. We had the articles of glass, the objects of glass that were the subjects on show in our big Marks of Genius exhibition, and just outside the door, the new images made by Sugimoto, as I think these were the first exhibition of those images that were made by him. This is actually an extraordinary triptych, 3 images joined together. It's now in the collection, it's not currently on show, but it's a wonderful piece. And I think just as a placeholder here for what Kelly is going to talk about, one of the other catalytic elements of the acquisition of the archive was to do with scholarship. And so we worked partly during the process of acquiring the archive with Larry Scharf, gaining his expertise and his perception of the importance of the collection. And through that came the idea that we might be the institutional home for a major research project, which has been the principal occupation of Larry for 40 years, four decades, of accumulating his extraordinary knowledge about the photographic work of William Henry Fox Talbot. And we thought that we might, having the archive, which of course included Talbot images, to provide an institutional home for the Catalogue Raisonné. And I'm going to leave Kelly to talk in more detail about that in a little while. But at this point, I'm going to hand over this special object to Hans.
Thank you.
The baton is now duly passed.
Thank you. As a dealer with a focus on 19th century photography, I've noticed over the past few years an uptick in interest by contemporary photographers. They're among the most passionate visitors to my exhibitions, and some have become clients. Now, this is important because not only are these photographers coming to look at these things, but some of them are actually saving up some money to acquire things for themselves so they can own their own touchstones, which can really help them and inspire them. From the beginning, Adam Fuss has been a regular. He was the first at the door when we had, at the opening of our Talbot exhibition of photogenic drawings back in 1996. I remember him nearly hyperventilating in front of a dimly lit case and needing to viscerally absorb each picture. The photographs in our show, the two dresses of the two lace baptismal dresses, they strongly reference Talbot, as do the images of pansies, which is a photogram. Now, let me see, how do I move forward? There we go. You see the examples of Talbot, this is Adam Fuss's lace baptismal dress, which is actually the very first one he ever did in 1997 when he began this series, which continued for a number of years. And, sorry, there's a portrait of Talbot's daughter, sort of showing it dressed in a similar sort of a lace dress. How do I, not moving. Do you aim it?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Recently I had the opportunity of examining Sugimoto's lace at close hand. This is an image that Sugimoto made in 2008 from a negative that he owns. It's a Talbot negative, photogenic drawing negative from 1839 that's about 5 by 7 inches, and he blew it up to a huge size, larger than the size you see on the screen, and printed it as a gelatin silver print. Then he toned the hell out of it to give it that color, that deep, dark orange color, which is one of the colors you would expect to find in some of the earliest of Talbot's photogenic drawings. The quality, looking at that, when you can go right up to it and nearly get your nose grease on the glass, and you will see those lines of those threads of lace hardly break up. And it really attests to the ability that Talbot had to render as much detail as he could, even with a paper negative. In addition, Sugimoto has long been intrigued by electrical experiments by Michael Faraday and Talbot. And you get, well, there's a, sorry, that's just a Talbot negative, a calotype negative of the elm tree at Laycock from 1843. And that's as a picture of Sugimoto's, let me make sure I get this one right. Okay. That's the picture of the negative that of the print that Sugimoto made from a negative that's at the Metropolitan Museum, a negative that dates from approximately 1835, probably very shortly after he made his famous oriel window picture that's at Laycock, the 1835 one that Talbot has actually dated, which is about the size of a postage stamp. This one's about the size of a playing card. But when Sugimoto blew it up, it's about the size you see on the screen. And you'll see that one we have downstairs in the exhibition. Again, he's toned it to the kinds of colors that Talbot was trying to was working with in his photogenic drawings. Now we move on to that's the electrostatic discharge wand that Richard referred to. And we've been very fortunate that the Bodleian Library has agreed to the loan of this magical object to our show downstairs. That is the instrument that Talbot used for his own electrical experiments, non-photographic. These are electrical experiments just given his broad encyclopedic interest in things at large and an interest that he shared with Michael Faraday. When Sugimoto saw this thing, he couldn't believe it. It was an object that he'd been looking for all of his life. He had been in the process of making these electrical images using another sort of an instrument and using this powerful Van de Graaff generator that propelled an incredible amount of energy into an instrument and creating an electric spark in his darkroom to illuminate a piece of film. And of course, all of this was done at random, so you couldn't predict what was going to come out. In this case, he borrowed this thing, brought it down to his darkroom, hooked it up to the electrodes, and created these sparks. And the sparks that he created from that, I think, have inspired him the most of all of these electrical pictures. And you'll see two of them downstairs. This, I don't have the magic touch here. Oh, there we go. That's one of them. And the original for that, and this is, and in the way he made these, they were made on a piece of film, a piece of large sheet film in his darkroom. He would create the exposure, then cut out the piece that spoke to him and make an enlargement from that. So that piece, the piece, the finished work is in fact quite a bit larger than what you're seeing there. And they are quite impactful.
Mind-blowing.
Fortunately not for him, because he's still alive and survived the experience. That's the photograph Richard was talking about that Talbot made of articles of glass, made in 1844. Looks like a shop window, when in fact he set up these shelves in his courtyard, put a piece of black drapery behind it, and very carefully placed those articles of glass on the shelves in a symmetrical fashion and photographed them. This was the image that he used as plate 4 of the Pencil of Nature, and he speaks about it. It follows the articles of China, which is much more reflective. This is much more reflects the light. This absorbs the light in a very different way and refracts it. So he found this a much more challenging subject to photograph. When Cornelia Parker discovered, when she was doing some work at the Bodleian, and she saw that they had these articles of glass, the original ones that survived from Talbot's photograph, and they're in the collection there. She begged them to, if she could borrow those, to use them to make her own images. And what she's done here is she has placed them. Some of them are single, some of them are in groups, and you have this random assortment of the articles placed on a polymer sheet and exposed to very bright light to create a printing plate. So here she's combining two of Talbot's inventions, the photogram, what we now call the photogram, and the photogravure. And we have the complete set of those on display downstairs, a complete set of 9. A negative Talbot made of the dormer window at Laycock. That's actually quite small, again, a little bit larger than a playing card. Abelardo Morel, a Cuban-born photographer who lives in New York, partly in New York, was inspired by Talbot and went and made a beeline to Laycock Abbey when he was making his camera obscura images. And he arranged with the curator there to set up the interior of some of the rooms by darkening the windows and putting a pinhole in one of the shades to project the exterior of Laycock Abbey onto the back wall. Of course, as anybody working with a camera obscura would remember, the projection would be upside down, as you would see in an early camera. And then he set up his camera and photographed what he saw. In this case, the upside down part of the courtyard with a dormer window very similar to the one in Talbot's. And you can see the chairs the right way up. So it's a very confusing thing when you first see it. We've had several people try to install these upside down, but we've had to correct them. It's a very natural thing to do. Get the next. Vera Luter, who has been working with the camera obscura for more than 25 years, and she's really she makes these monumental negatives. There's some of the very, very beautiful things. In this case, it's some trees in the snow out in cold spring, where's that?
Cold Spring Harbor.
It's Cold Spring, New York. Yeah. Cold Spring, New York, which is outside the house of Malcolm Daniel, who some of you know. And she explained to me that she set up his guest cottage, darkened all the windows, put her piece of negative paper, and this negative is about 2.5 meters wide. It's the largest one I have seen. And darkened the room. It projected the light from a pinhole onto that back wall. And it was an exposure of, she said, of 7 to 9 hours. In the very deep snow, she remembers it being particularly cold that day. It was in February of 2014, I believe. And then she arrived at this result, developing the negative. That is the original negative, and you'll see the original negative on display downstairs. Mike Robinson, who's made some beautiful images of Talbot's home, paradoxically using his mastery of the daguerreotype process. Now, can you imagine the audacity of bringing Daguerre's invention to Laycock Abbey, the home of Daguerre's rival, and using that to photograph Talbot's home, which was the first building Talbot himself had photographed?
It's almost an act of war.
It was all done very good-naturedly, and Mike does continue to come to Laycock on a regular basis, and he gives workshops teaching the daguerreotype. I've not had one of those, but I've spoken with some who have, and they say it's an unbelievable experience. Grant Romer, who many of you will remember from being the great conservator at the George Eastman House and the head of education there, and also a photographer and a marvelous public speaker, took it upon himself to dig into the daguerreotype a little bit more, but in an unusual way. He noticed, by combing through Talbot's 1839 notebooks, he found reference to the fact that Talbot himself had been doing some experiments with the daguerreotype. And this was before he knew of any of the details of Daguerre's process, and he called it the iotype, involving iodine. And he's made a few of these last year, and he showed them to me a few months ago, and I must say, there's a spectacular group of pictures. The colors you see are unlike anything you see in a daguerreotype. They're more akin to the sort of colors you would see in a salt print or a photogenic drawing. The problem is, the moment these pictures are fixed, they lose a lot of those magical colors. This is an image of one of the pictures that we have. We have it in a box. I don't dare exhibit these things, although Grant has encouraged me to do so. He said, look, you better show these things. People need to see what they look like, and we'll see what happens. They might disappear, that's that. I just didn't have the heart to do that. But I do have them in a box. If somebody wants to see them, please come and ask us. The ones that are on a display are 3 of the hypo-fixed ones, or not hypo, but they're iodine fixed. So they're much more stable. So basically, the concept of this exhibition arose out of the realization that with the digital revolution, now more than ever, it seems that photographers are inspired and influenced by these earliest practitioners. Photographers such as these are the most articulate ambassadors for us to interact with the pioneers of the medium. Now at Photo London, it's my pleasure to present some of Talbot's treasured photographs alongside contemporary works by these ambassadors. Kelly, let me see if there's a Talbot photogenic drawing from 1839, and Talbot's view of the Chateau de Chambord, made in 1843, when he went to France to try to forge an alliance with a French photographer, the Marquis de Bassano, to do some collaborative work. That failed miserably, but a few beautiful photographs have come down to us.
Thank you.
Kelly.
Those of you who know me know that I have a hard time sitting still when I talk, so I'm at least going to stand up, because sitting in a chair and talking seems like something that I shouldn't do. And then I can't see all of you from behind this pillar. So I want to talk a little bit about the project that both of you have alluded to, which is opening out Talbot into further experiments, into further adventures, and also into further scholarship. Nearly 15 years ago, the correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot was published. And since I'm here speaking on behalf of Larry Schaff, I think it's only appropriate to say that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really a testament to Larry's absolutely undying energy in attempting to get early photography recognized. And that means recognized in all sorts of ways, recognized in the art world, recognized in scholarship, recognized in the academy, in the university, all as a serious subject of study. And I want to talk a little bit about how all of these projects come together to form a kind of a digital community that I like to call Digital Talbot. The new, if you think daguerreotypes are bad, then Digital Talbot seems even worse. But in actual fact, it brings us together in quite interesting ways. As I said, about 15 years ago, in 2000, I think we launched the first version in 2002 or in 2003 of the correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot. As it said in my intro, my bio, I was one of the assistant editors drafted in the middle of my PhD to transcribe letters. And anyone who's read thousands of someone else's letters will know you get to be quite familiar with these people. Larry is even more familiar with them because the project started a long time before 2003, a long time before 2000 in actual fact. It began way back when the Science Museum first acquired quite a lot of the Talbot correspondence and a large Talbot collection. At that time, Christine Heap, who was the librarian there at the time, made a hand list of the Talbot correspondence, and at some point, some money was given by the Science Museum to publish this select correspondence. And a select correspondence, as you know, is a sort of deeply unsatisfying thing. It sends you away wishing that you had seen more and that you could see more. But all of these letters were quite inaccessible. Sitting down and reading thousands of Talbot's letters is not always fun. It's always interesting, but many of them are quite dull. When Larry went to the problem with being an independent scholar is that very often getting a very large project off the ground is quite difficult. As Richard alluded to, these projects are not insignificant in their size. They require large teams of people who can work together over a period of time, usually at an institution. And institutional patronage is a very, very important thing. The University of Glasgow gave Larry a post, part of a post, in 1995 already. He was able then to apply for funding from the British Academy, who then gave him the funding to begin the correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot draft calendar. A draft calendar, if a selected correspondence is somewhat unsatisfying, a draft calendar is somehow even worse because it gives you the entire scope of what the collection might be, but doesn't allow you to read any of it. And those of you who know the letters of Herschel, all we have is a draft calendar, and they have little selected snippets of what seems to be important about the letters, which is a deeply unsatisfying way to kind of get into the letters. Larry then conceived of the project that we worked on, let's see if I can get it to go, for many years, which was an online transcription of just under 10,000 letters when it was published and just over 10,000 letters now that are fully searchable online. Now, as it's nearly 15 years old, which is for a digital site, an ancient age, the site has moved from the University of Glasgow to De Montfort University, where it is still hosted. It does occasionally go wrong, for which I apologize. Some of you in the audience have occasionally waited for us to put it back online when it does go wrong, so we appreciate your patience. It is a project, however, that has spawned other kinds of projects. At the time when the Talbot correspondence went online, it was impossible to just sit down for days at a time and read these letters from beginning to end. What searching allows you to do is to find the letters either by correspondent or by keyword and understand what's interesting in your subject in these 10,000 letters. After reading 10,000 of them, I sort of know what's in them, even though you do forget them. But it's important because it's brought together a certain kind of scholarship that photographic history did not have before then. You had to be lucky enough and have the time enough and know the curators well enough to be able to get in for a huge length of time and read. And bringing it online opens out Talbot scholarship to different kinds of historians, different kinds of art historians, different artists who all have access all over the world, even if they're not as lucky as we are, because we live in Britain where these enormous collections reside, and they are in public institutions that allow enormous amounts of access to original materials, which is not the case in every country. And it's spawned things since then, and I'm just going to mention some of the other big projects that have gone online that are very important to photographic history scholarship. The Niepce correspondence, Letters and Documents Online, which of course is an online extension of some very early work from the Musée Niepce. Roger Fenton's Crimean Letter Books, which we actually piggybacked off of some other grant money. It's also hosted by de Montfort, which is brings together the two different letter books that were made from Roger Fenton's letters, one by his daughter, one by his brother, and merges them into one site. And more recently at Yale, the Photogrammer experiment that is online that allows geo-mapping of the FSA photographs. It is a tremendous site. And they are, of course, joined by quite a lot of online activity by collections who are trying to put as much of their collections online as they can, making scholarship for us possible. And they can... I'm having the same trouble I'm having. Oh, and more recently, just months ago in Heidelberg, at the Heidelberg Library, a full edition of camera work has been digitized and put online and made completely accessible to anyone who wants to go there. This is quite new. Heidelberg has a large digitization project going on. And this is quite useful because they've digitized all the images. The images are searchable, the text is searchable. Not too long ago, the entire text of The Penciled Nature was put online so that we could begin to study the last 5 volumes as much as we study the first 5, which are more plentiful. All of these things have, oh, help. Oh, what did I do? I'm sorry, I've turned it off. Me and technology. Here I am talking about the digital and I turn off my own things. Just recently, Miriam Brusius managed to, along with the British Library, managed to put hand list of the papers of William Henry Fox Talbot online, which gives us a sense not just for the letters, but also for what is in Talbot's notebook. Talbot was a prolific note-taker. His notebooks are filled with the weird and wonderful, and there are many of them. They're all shapes and sizes. They're like a complete proliferation of bizarre and happenstance notebooks, because they come in all shapes and sizes, and they have all sorts of different subjects, even within them, although he did keep some of them separate. I'll try and press it more carefully now. Help. And within the notebooks, you can begin to see what might be the future of what digital Talbot can do for scholarship, and not just photohistorical scholarship, but all kinds of scholarship. In the notebooks, you can find correspondence, printed material, legal material, financial material, pocket notebooks, herbaria, calling cards and invitations, poetry and verse, and really bad puns. Talbot wrote very bad puns. I recommend not reading them because they do make you groan terribly. But what's interesting about the digital Talbot is it's become about not just photographic history, but it's about how we can begin to see history of a particular time period through the lens of a person who is known for his photography. And this becomes very important because it brings photographic history and photographs into the mainstream of how we study the history of the 19th century. And I find that a very important step. And it means that what we do, everything that we consider Talbot scholarship and everything that we consider Talbot projects, especially bringing it online, has the potential of expanding the field of research through photographic history. And people might be researching other things. We've already spoken about the Catalogue Raisonné, which is going online currently. In the end, hopefully it will have 20,000 records, photographs. And that means not just individual photographs, but many, many, many prints of the same things. it's very unusual to realize how prolific Talbot was as a photographer. In 1839, he sent out more than 800 photographs. It's in one of his notebooks. He made lists of how many he'd sent to which person. And when you tot them all up, even in 1839, he sent out more than 800 photographs. And that was just the beginning. What's interesting is that it allows people to come up with new characters. We always knew that Talbot was very involved. We always knew that Talbot had a huge circle of correspondence. His scientific correspondence are fantastic. But I want to use a different example today to show just a tiny way in which photography can expand our notion of what 19th century history should include. And I want to use the example of Ameline Petit de Billiers, who was the governess for Talbot's half-sisters. Amelina and Talbot became, and Henry, as I'll call him, Henry and Amelina became great friends. And she was a very, very smart woman. And their letters are fascinating. What's interesting is that Amelina doesn't turn up in any Talbot scholarship before the letters went online. Not much. She turns up briefly in the biography. But we find that actually there are 106 letters between the two of them. And this, not just any old letters either. They're letters that cover scientific endeavor. They're letters that cover her employment and her place in the family. Now, as anyone who does 19th century history knows that we don't very often get to read about women. And when we do get to read about them, they're not normally the governess. This allows us insight into something fascinating that we normally don't have any insight into. And Amelina, of course, was the main correspondent when Talbot tried to set up his business with the Marquis de Bassano in Paris. And she is the go-between in one of the very first stories about photography and industry, or photography as an industry. And she is a fascinating correspondent and gives us many, many scintillating and curious details about the relationship that normally we wouldn't really be able to find out. There are very few letters between the Marquis de Bassano and Talbot. So Nancy Keeler wrote a wonderful article detailing that process. And opening out the idea that Amelina is an important person has led to other online sites. For instance, putting the journal, Amelina's journal, online. The journal of a governess from the 19th century, a French governess who happened to live quite a lot of her time in Britain, who also happened to be there at the invention of photography and is great friends with Talbot. This is a great resource, a fascinating resource. She's been mentioned in several books, and not just books about the Talbots, but also books about women and children in country houses. What are the lives of women and children in country houses? You know, we don't really know. There are not a lot of resources. The Talbot correspondence is one of those resources, as is the Catalogue Raisonné. Now, the Catalogue Raisonné is a fascinating and interesting project. It is huge, complicated. No one's ever tried to do a Catalogue Raisonné of all photographs by a particular person. The task is quite daunting. There are things that we can think of doing. There are many things that we will not be able to do within the scope of the Catalogue Raisonné, and yet we have hope of taking it into the future. And when I talk future, I'm thinking very much about the kind of scholarship that Chitra Ramalingam and Miriam Brusius recently published in their fantastic book about beyond photography. Where does this go beyond photography? How do we begin to use photography and photographic history as a place where we do history of other things? In the Catalogue Raisonné are these two busts, and I happen to know, so I can find them. And they match the letters that we have, of course, in the correspondence, where Talbot is giving his assessment of these particular images that were sent from the Marquis de Bassano. And he said which ones are striking, of course, and that these three pictures, an arch in the Oval Courtyard, the statue of Minerva, etc., are the only ones worth displaying. The others were pretty much, as Richard already said, a disaster. And this is why the Marquis de Bassano did not go into business eventually with the calotype. And we're able to begin bringing together these kinds of electronic formats in order to talk more about these images and talk more about the correspondence, but not as separate objects, but as whole continuous stories. And we can envision a future where perhaps we'll be able to bring notebooks in. Who knows? Who knows what we can bring in? What's more important about Digital Talbot is about the scholarly community and about the photographic community. It creates a much more international community. People can go online, we can have the same kinds of research. People can be researching in countries where they don't have access to the Bodleian Library to come in and look at the originals. This will broaden the field, I think, and it will remain a kind of bright and shining example of how to further international research and international cooperation through photography. So thank you.
So I guess we have some time if there are questions which you would like to put to the three of us. Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you guys thought of, as part of the digitization effort, to open up and to invite in different people and so on to make it simpler to access. Has anybody thought of having Henry Talbot's own hashtag on Instagram? Should that be curated by an academic instead of just being free for?
Interesting idea. Yeah, hadn't thought of that.
I'd love it. Do you want to pay me to do it? Unfortunately, there are a lot of things we could do. As I said, they're big and they're complicated, and someone has to fund them. At the moment, Larry works most of his days on trying to keep the letters up to date and get the Catalogue Raisonné online. But unfortunately, it's a monumental task. And he's been writing most of the blogs himself as well. And anyone who does social media will know just exactly how draining it is and how much time it takes to keep things up to date enough when you have other things on hand that need to be done. Even if Talbot letters go down, we start receiving emails within the hour that the correspondence has gone down, and I always feel like saying, yes, I'm working on it, I'm sorry, I have to teach this afternoon, it will be several hours before I'm able to get to it. So these things need time, and they need curation, and until institutions realize that, then it will remain a pipe dream.
But I do encourage you to go onto the Catalogue Raisonné website, find the blog, and subscribe to the blog, because it's and look the past 4 years of Larry and various other collaborators, including Kelly, I think.
I haven't written a blog yet.
You haven't written a
I'm
blog
sorry.
yet, right,
It doesn't go in the ref.
But there are, it's a fantastic resource, scholarly resource in itself, in addition to the Catalogue Raisonné. So encourage everyone to subscribe to Larry's blog.
It comes out every Thursday at midnight, or is it Friday at midnight?
Friday at midnight.
And without fail, for the last 4 years, it's been a new one, and each one has been on a topic that's very focused on Talbot, Talbotiana, and it's fascinating. It's very well written and illustrated.
Some more questions?
You've bamboozled them into silence.
Can I ask Larry, sorry, Hans, of all the you talk about the photographers who've come into your exhibition gallery in New York and seen Talbot on show, but are there photographers who haven't taken up the baton of Talbot who you think ought to, who would be fantastic collaborators?
Well, I could think of just about any photographer working today in some capacity must have some recognition of what Talbot contributed to the field, contributed to their working life. And so I would certainly welcome any one of them to come in. There have been quite a number who have come in unbeknownst to me, derived some kind of satisfaction or maybe revulsion. Maybe some of them just refuse to acknowledge Talbot's influence on them, which is very possible. But I can't imagine that there could be too many of those.
And how much is the kind of chemistry, the science of Talbot's photography, a moment that's happened since the digital? So if you like, the abundance of digital imagery has created a kind of renewed interest in the physical processes of generating a photographic image. And how much has
Talbot been part of that process, would you say?
Part of the process of
Or the movement of sort of rediscovering early photographic processes by contemporary photographers?
I think very much so. I see basically the digital revolution is really in a way completely separate from analog. It's like scratching your right ear with your left hand. It's going around things just the opposite way. The end result may appear to be very similar, but they're approached in very different ways. So I think there are people who just need some grounding, and it's very easy to get lost in this world, and especially when you're a photographer working with this kind of process. There's so much new technology that's being developed every day that in order to hold on to what you have and move forward with it is a very difficult thing to do. So if you can look backwards and see how the pioneers did it, Talbot and others, it gives you a certain sense of level ground that can help you advance in a rational way.
It's also quite interesting because the kind of processes that were done in the 19th century are all things that you can make by hand in your bathroom sink. And these are important with the fall of the photographic industry and the restriction of the kinds of materials that you can get. In the heyday of analog, you could get all sorts of things that would do great and fantastic, have great and fantastic effects, visual effects. And now that is becoming more and more restricted. There's less and less silver in things as it gets more and more expensive, and we've all lived through this. You can't get your favorite developer anymore. You can't get this paper. You can't get that paper. You can't get this film. You can't get that film. What's really attractive about all of these projects is that people can go back and look at them and study them and do them in their kitchen sink. Well, bathroom sink, maybe. If you have a very understanding family or partner and they don't mind the color of your sink after a while.
And you can still get hold of the supplies. I mean, you sometimes have to search on eBay, but there are old supplies of paper, film. Some of them are exhausted. But even with exhausted film and paper, you can come up with some pretty interesting results. The important thing is to try to stabilize them and fix them as best you can so that the results that you're looking at can stay. There are some photographers who like Grant Romer, who's encouraging us to allow his works to live their lives and to transform. I have a basic problem with that, but
so do I, as a preservation institution.
Yes.
Institution, we react badly to.
But of course, that's the natural life of photographic history as well. I mean, all these letters between the Niepce brothers, Claude and Nicephore, when he would create images made with silver salts, and then he would send them off to Claude, and then he would say, here, you look at it like this, but open it in the shadow or by candlelight, because you'll have a longer time to look at it, that is, before it goes completely black. And a lot of our early photographic material before 1839 was that way. We don't have any images from them. We know there were images, they just haven't come down to us.
And also if you look at one of these very, very early, the light-sensitive ones, which we have, the ones in the show we have covered with facsimiles. There are 5 of them in the show. And if you ask one of us, we can show you the original. In a way, what you recognize is every inspection of that original in any kind of light is in some way impacting its life. For some people, it's an abhorrent thought, understandably for a librarian. But for others, there's certain collectors who just love the frisson of owning one of these things, or to be able to take it out on a special occasion, like in some cases, there's some watercolor colors that will change from exposure to too much light. Same thing with a salt-fixed photogenic drawing. If it's exposed too much, it will begin to change. For some, it'll be a much longer period of time. Some, it'll be really quite a short period of time. There exist even some unfixed examples of Talbot's work. And those are the most fugitive of all, which I would recommend a very dim candle for examining those. But still, the act of looking at them is something that's really makes your toes tingle.
Because I know there are
So if I understand the question correctly, that exposure well, really any, is it a photograph or these early photographs or any work on paper? Early photographs. With the exception of cyanotypes, I'm not aware of any of them regenerating if they're stored. Although the cyanotype I've heard can be, if it's exposed to an intense amount of light, it could slightly pale, and if the conditions are reversed, it can begin to regenerate. But I don't know of any. I'm not sure that I haven't heard of any of the regeneration possibilities for anything other than that. Did I understand your question correctly? Yeah.
I think we had another question at the back of the room. Yeah. Sorry, could you speak up?
Yes, I'm trying. With this ongoing scholarship and the work of Talbot in public institutions, has it become more clear how much of this entire body of work is in hands of collectors and on the art market and in public institutions? Do you have
Yeah.
clear
We will do, but not quite yet. We're still in the process of gathering all of the data. One of the interesting things about the Catalogue Raisonné is that the first release of data that we made, the first sort of beta launch, which was made about just over a year ago, has surfaced lots of people writing into Larry to say, you better come and have a look. And there's been many more surviving images have surfaced as a result of that. So we're still in the process of accommodating that information, enhancing the Catalogue Raisonné. And so in due course, by the time the project is finished, we will actually be able to know that information. But the vast bulk of it is in the hands of public institutions, and mostly in this country. And then there's a long tail of overseas institutions and private collectors, both here and overseas. Yes? Could you just wait for the microphone, please?
Yep.
It's maybe a question for Hans about going back to what we were talking about earlier about preservation. So the contemporary artists, are they more concerned with working with objects derived from Talbot, or are any of them kind of exploring ideas about preservation in using the processes in the contemporary way?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing that.
Maybe
Yes, I can. Yeah.
in terms of going back to the preservation conversation we were having earlier, the contemporary artists, are they dealing more with the objects derived from Talbot, or are they kind of exploring ideas around preservation?
It's all the above. Some of them are intrigued by actually being exposed to the original object. Some are inspired by just the image of it, or the idea of it, or the location, or the writings of Talbot. So it's all the above.
I think our time has come to an end. So I'd like to thank you for joining us
Thank
for
you
this
very much.
session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.